Hi, this is Kit. I am going to walk you through some modifications that I made to a pattern that is available online called the Kleinia. So this shows you one of my finished shirts. I actually made almost a dozen of them. So this is called the Kleinia blouse. It is available on Mood Society. So I'll have a link to this in my notes on this YouTube video. I made the pattern to spec a while back. You can see how short my hair was. So this shows you building the pattern, which actually had an open back that was buttoned up. So you can see I learned how to do some buttonholing, which was fun. Fun part of this pattern. But in the end, I wasn't super happy with how this fit me. And so I started making modifications, and little by little over the course of this pattern, I made 10 major modifications. This shows you I did learn how to use a rolled hem footer, which I'll have some more information about that in my modifications further in this video. But that's the Kleinia blouse, how it sewed up. So it looked better tucked in, which is how it's pictured on the website. And you can see some of the buttons on the back right there, which that's a nice little detail. But I didn't like how big this shirt was on me. So I decided I was going to narrow the pattern using a knit shirt that I already owned. So you can see there's that original shirt that I made with the pattern. And my knit shirt is a lot narrower. So you can see I already drew in, before realizing I wanted to make this into a video, I drew in the little narrowing there, again following kind of the utmost width of the narrowest part of my shirt. And I also made the sleeve a little narrower as well, so it just fit my arm a little bit more closely. So that's modification number 1. Modification 2 was actually connecting the body and the yoke segments of the pattern by overlapping both. That allows you to reduce some of the steps of the pattern, like there's a little bit less cutting, and sewing is a little simpler. So it ends up being a 1/2 inch of an overlap between the yoke and the bottom part of both the front and the back patterns. So you can see I drew in that 1/2 inch, and I'm pinning up my pattern. Now, because this was my first modification with the narrower width, I actually used some tracing paper to get that on my fabric, which you'll see here in a moment, I believe. But I didn't want to cut the paper until I was certain that this modification, that narrowing, was going to work. So I just used tracing paper there to mark the paper. Again, this was modification number 2, was connecting that yoke with the bottom. So next was merging the back into a single piece. So in the original pattern, there's buttons that go down the back. They're really pretty, but it's just a heck of a lot of work. So I eliminated that back hem by just moving the pattern off the side by 1 inch. So you can kind of see that right there. It's going over 1 inch. So that one's a pretty simple modification to make. I'm still overlapping the yoke and the bottom of that back as well. The next modification is you draw a guideline for the fake yoke seam using the top of the bottom pattern. Now that is going to make a lot more sense when the video starts. So that means just trace it out using washable marker. It's just going to make it a lot easier to sew later on, and then you just have to do the same thing. Once you cut the pattern out, you have to do it on the reverse side, because this is, of course, a folded over pattern. But that makes it very easy to sew up later after the pattern is cut out. And I generally just use washable markers for my pattern edges. So another really important modification is adding a flare that allows you to start the rolled hem on scrap fabric before you reach the garment. Now, this is going to make more sense when you see the video. So you can see there's the neck. And I'm just tracing that out with my marker. And now I'm going to add that flare. So I'm going to extend that mark above that seam at the shoulders. And I'm just kind of dotting in the actual seam because I'm going to have to go back and cut the pattern to make sure that it's, back to the where it's supposed to be, but it gives me a little bit of scrap fabric to play with. So you're going to see it again here on the back. Just to make sure that you understand this. This allows you to get that rolled hem started without actually being on your garment fabric. So we saw some of this footage earlier. You can see I'm going on to, I can't remember the name, the selvage, I think, of the fabric, which won't matter because again, it's scrap yarn. So I'm drawing in the neck hem and I'm going to extend it with that flare. And then I'm making sure to very well mark the actual cut line for that shoulder part because you're going to want to cut out that scrap fabric after you do the rolled hem. So you can kind of see it there. So I cut out that neck area first, and then I also cut it out with that scrap fabric flare just to make sure that I don't forget and cut it off later on. So you can see that little triangle. Now, the next modification is you're going to hem that front and back with that rolled hem footer. That's what that looks like. It's a strange little footer device. It takes the fabric and it curls it over into a double curl before it lines it up to stitch. So this footer is very fun to use. The narrowest one always worked best for me with the knit fabric. I think the other sizes would work okay with woven fabric. Now, the one modification that I make is I slightly move the needle. So it's just ever so slightly to the right. I've just found that means I have a more successful rolled hem at the end. Now this is where I'm preparing my fabric to go through the rolled hem. You can see all that scrap fabric right there above that line. That doesn't matter. So it can be a little bit messy once I stabilize the rest of the hem. And it's going to be following along a curve, which is never easy with a rolled hem. But I've got it down. So to start it, you do a double, like you basically make your own little rolled hem. If you're especially neurotic, you can iron it even and it will make it even more structural. But for me, I just hand roll it and then I secure it with a little pin or a long one. So then I get this lined up under my footer. So to get going, I usually have it a little bit past, so I'm not working straight off the edge. It's just easier to get it rolling. I get one single stitch. I get the needle inserted, and then I lift the footer, and I use something to help curl my fabric into the metal curl of the foot. So you can see I'm using my stitch ripper to do that. And then to proceed with the rolled hem footer, you have to just be very careful about giving it only like 1/4 inch of fabric so that you don't over roll it. So it takes that curl in and it's going to extra curl it. So when it comes out the end, it's going to be a completely rolled hem. And it's going to be very neat, very stable stitching. But I do this very slowly. and I'm constantly shifting the fabric around because you're working on a curve, which is even more difficult. Using a rolled footer with straight fabric, with straight woven fabric is very easy, but with knit fabric on a curve, it's pretty difficult. So I sped up this footage a lot. You can see how careful and neurotic I am with making sure that that curve, the little curl of fabric, is lined up for that foot to grab and then finish that rolled hem. So this part is probably the most detailed. I have messed this up. I've actually gone in and I ripped out stitches and I've just hand stitched to help stabilize things as needed. So just finishing off there. Now my 7th modification was you can sew in the false or faux seam, and you can do this actually before you do that rolled hem or after, it doesn't matter. But it needs to be done before modification 8. So you can see that faux seam is sewn in. I love the structural look of that. So now you're going to seam the shoulders, hem the sleeves, and then sew the sides together in that order. So you're making sure that the rolled hem is lined up on the top of those shoulders when you sew. And then you're going to use your the open fabric to do the hem on the sleeves before you sew up the sides. It's just going to be a lot easier to approach the project that way. Finally, 9th modification, sew a blind hem on the bottom. I've done a lot of different hems with this pattern, and I think the blind hem is really my favorite. So you go ahead and you iron it exactly where you want it to be. I never iron, but I think that it's important for this. Then you place pins. You place them so that they're pointed down, because you're actually going to be flipping the fabric around to do this blind hem. So you can see all of my pins are pointed to the downside. And then I'm going to show you how to set up your machine after this. I think that the blind hem just leaves a really nice finish on the bottom of the garment that looks very professional. So here we go. I'm shifting my stitches to that blind hem stitch. I'm making the stitch longer. That's just my preference. I'm moving the width to 2. I keep it pretty narrow, pretty tight, but if you're not used to this stitch, you might want it to be like 4 in width instead, because you just have to be really careful that you're getting those blind stitches moved onto your fabric and then the rest off when you're working at a narrow width, like a number 2, which is the setting I'm on. So I just move my needle manually until it's ready to take the plunge on that blind hem or the blind stitch. And then I get my fabric on, so I make sure that the blind stitch is going to go into my live fabric. And then I make sure everything is looking correct. And then for those other stitches, the like fake stitches, I don't know what to call them, they're going to go on that little tail that's on the right. And so you can see my needle is approaching, or not my needle, my pin is approaching, and it is such so it's easy to pull out with the way that I put it in. So this can go pretty slow because you want to make sure that that 5th stitch goes into your real fabric and every other stitch stays off of your real fabric and stays in that little tail. So again, I sped up the footage here, but it's worth it to just take your time because this does give the bottom of the shirt like a really nice finish. And I've finished it several different ways. This is my favorite. So this is what I'm showing here. Just pulling those pins as I go. It seems to take forever, but it's kind of the finale. There's really only one more thing to do after this, and it's a super simple thing. And then you have a shirt made. So I just kind of lock the stitches at the end just to prevent some unraveling in the future. Although the nice thing about making your own shirt is you know how it was constructed, so you can fix things if they go wrong. Now, I prefer to just really stabilize the hem at the seams. So I think I have a little bit of footage doing that, but you can see, there's the one side of the blind hem with the little zigzag over, and then whoop, it just did those little nips, took those little bites, and I have a very beautiful hem at the bottom of my shirt with fun little fruit. So this is where I just like to go through and just lock in at those seams. It's not neat, it's not blind, but I figure it's just the edges, so it really doesn't matter all that much. So I like to take the time to do that with the sides. And it doesn't catch as much when you're putting it on and off. So here is that shirt. So it's pretty much finished. But I have one more modification to suggest, and this really depends upon the type of fabric that you're using. See, there's a beautiful blind hem. Now I am going to point out how the fabric is kind of curling at that rolled hem. You can see that like weird wave there. That relaxes once you've washed the shirt. The fabric relaxes, and so that weird curl goes away. Now, some of these stiffer knits, they don't lie flat on the arm, and so I add a small pleat. So you can kind of see some footage from an early shirt when I did this. See how there's like a weird little ducktail on the end of the shirt? I did not like that. It made it look super homemade, and I don't want this to look super homemade. So that's the pleat. It looks super adorable. You just pleat in to the corner, and it's just this lovely little end at the edge of your sleeve, and that only is necessary with some of the fabric. So you can see here's a lineup of almost all the shirts I've made. I've gotten so many compliments on that dinosaur one, I can't even tell you. So here's one of those shirts. That one's a really like loose knit, and it's like a little bit heavier. There's one of my others, and it's nice enough that I was able to use it in my family photo this year, a shirt that I made. So here is that pattern again. Look for that linked in the notes of this YouTube video, and you can use the modifications from this video to make the shirts that I showed you today. Cheers!